I woke up with 300 kilograms of support beam across my chest and the taste of blood in my mouth. The math came first, like it always does. I measured the beam by eye, 2.4 meters of composite strut, fractured at the midpoint where the bulkhead mount had sheared during impact. The weight pressed down through my ribs, but the angle kept it from crushing me completely. I had maybe 30 centimeters of clearance before my lungs would stop working. The pocket scriber was still clipped to my belt. I worked it free with my left hand, the right was pinned, and used the diamond tip to scratch a cut line into the beam's lower surface. 15 centimeters from my chest. Mark it once, twice. Get it right the first time because you won't get a second. The handheld torch was somewhere in the rubble. I felt around until my fingers found the grip, then triggered the plasma arc. Blue-white light filled the compartment. The beam began to glow along the cut line. Composite separates cleanly if you keep the temperature even and don't rush. I counted to 60, watching the material soften and part, then kicked the severed section sideways. It rolled away and I dragged myself out from under the rest. My name is Evan Foster. I'm the structural engineer for the Commonwealth survey vessel Hearth, and I just survived a landing that should have killed everyone aboard. The compartment door was jammed but not welded shut. I braced my boots against the frame and pulled until the seals cracked. Daylight poured through. Actual daylight, white and harsh, and I had to shield my eyes while they adjusted. When I could see again, I stepped out onto the hull's exterior plating and looked at what we'd become. The Hearth had broken into 3 major sections scattered across a basin the size of a small city. The core section, the part I'd just climbed out of, stood upright like a gutted tower, maybe 3 stories tall. One flank had been peeled open, exposing internal decks and the remains of crew quarters. The aft section lay a kilometer to the east, nose down in dark soil. The forward section was just gone, probably vaporized during re-entry when the heat shields failed. And in the center of the core section, visible through the torn hull plating, the field coil sat in its housing like a cracked egg. The coil is what keeps a ship from burning up when it hits atmosphere, a magnetic field generator that bleeds off velocity by pushing against a planet's ionosphere. Ours had cracked during the descent. I could see the damage from here, a jagged split running down the coil's primary winding, with temporary bracing holding the pieces together. Every few seconds, a thin blue arc jumped from the crack to the nearest metal surface. 17 people were alive at the base of the wreck. I counted them twice to be sure. Captain Mark Doyle stood in the center, a tall man with iron-grey hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from 30 years of deep space command. He saw me and waved me down. I descended using an external maintenance ladder that was still bolted to the hull. My ribs ached where the beam had pressed, but nothing felt broken. "Foster," Doyle said when I reached the ground. "How bad is it?" "The core's stable for now," I said. "The coil housing is compromised, but it's not actively failing. I'll need to run a full structural assessment before I can say if we can use it for shelter." "Make it a priority. We need cover before nightfall." I nodded and started toward the supply cache that someone had already organized near the wreck's base. Plastic crates, stacked in neat rows, their contents labeled in marker on the sides. Rations, water, medical, tools. Dr. Lauren Pike was crouched beside one of the crates, inventorying medical supplies. She was maybe 10 years older than me, with short brown hair and the kind of steady hands you want when someone's bleeding out on a table. She'd been the Hearth's xenobiologist. We'd been surveying uncharted worlds for mineral deposits. But now she was the closest thing we had to a doctor. "Evan." She looked up. "Are you injured?" "Bruised. Nothing urgent." "Let me know if that changes." She returned to her count, fingers moving across packages of wound sealant and broad-spectrum antibiotics. I grabbed a toolkit and a portable scanner, then headed back to the core section. The structural assessment took 2 hours. I worked my way through each deck, marking load points with my scriber and testing welds with a sonic probe. The core had landed on its keel, which was good. The weight was distributed across the thickest part of the hull. The damaged flank was a problem, but I could reinforce it with cable and anchor bolts if we had time. The field coil worried me more. The crack was leaking charge in irregular pulses, and the scaffolding someone had jury-rigged around it looked like it had been assembled by people who'd never seen a load-bearing structure before. I climbed up to inspect it and found 3 of the support struts installed backwards. I was counting the fasteners holding the scaffolding together, 28 visible, probably 16 more hidden behind panels, when I heard the sound outside. Not quite a drumbeat. More like a sustained pulse traveling through the ground and up into the hull plating beneath my boots. I descended and walked out to where Doyle stood with Pike and a handful of others, all of them staring at the basin's edge. They'd arrived while I was working. The assembly, that's what we started calling them within the first hour because they gathered in rows like components being fitted together, stood at the rim of the basin in perfect silence. 24 figures, maybe more. They were tall, each one close to 7 feet, with smooth grey-brown skin and limbs that looked like bundles of reeds wrapped in leather. Their torsos were broader than their frames suggested, and as I watched, one of them expanded a section of its chest. The skin stretched like a drumhead, then contracted with a sound that I felt more than heard. "How long have they been there?" I asked. 10 minutes, Doyle said. "They haven't moved." Pike had a pair of field binoculars pressed to her eyes. "They're bipedal, bilateral symmetry. Those chest structures, they're organic resonating chambers. Possibly for communication." "Or intimidation," someone muttered behind me. The assembly began to move toward points around the perimeter of our crash site. They spread out in a wide circle, each one stopping at a position that seemed deliberate. Then they started building. They pulled cable from the wreckage, thick braided lines that we'd used for cargo rigging, and wove them into vertical structures twice the height of a human. Hull fragments were pressed into the gaps. Pale stones the size and shape of human vertebrae were threaded onto the cables like beads. The structures grew fast, maybe 20 minutes from first stake to finished product. When they were done, the assembly stepped back and resumed their drumming. "What are those?" Doyle asked. "Markers," I said. "Or warnings." Pike lowered the binoculars. "We need samples." "Negative," Doyle said. "We maintain distance until we understand what we're dealing with." "Captain, if those are communication structures, then they're communicating with each other. Foster, can we secure the core section?" "Yes, but it'll take time." "You have until dark. I want everyone inside before nightfall." I returned to the wreck and organized a work crew. We hauled cable and welding gear up to the damaged flank and began sealing the breach. It was rough work, cold bonds and temporary patches, but it would keep wind and rain out. The assembly kept drumming. Every few minutes the sound would shift in pitch, and I'd feel it travel up through my boots and into my bones. By the time we finished, the sun was setting behind the ridges that ringed the basin. The light turned the landscape rust orange, then deep purple. The assembly stopped drumming and dispersed, moving away from their structures and disappearing into the darkness beyond the rim. We ate inside the core section that night. Ration packs heated over a small chemical stove. 18 people in a space designed for crew quarters and storage. Someone had strung emergency lights from the overhead, casting pale blue illumination across faces that were still streaked with ash and dried blood. Doyle gathered everyone near the coil housing, where the heat from its residual discharge kept the temperature livable. "We don't know where we are," he said. "The nav system is gone, and our emergency beacon is damaged. Brett, how long can we stretch our supplies?" Brett Colton, the quartermaster, a broad-shouldered man with an easy smile that didn't match the situation, glanced at the inventory slate in his hands. 3 weeks if we ration carefully. 4 if we cut deeper. And after that, we'll need to forage or make contact. Pike spoke up from where she sat with her back against a support strut. "The native population is clearly intelligent and organized. If we can establish communication, we maintain distance, Doyle said. That's not negotiable. We don't know their intentions, and we're in no position to defend ourselves if they're hostile. They didn't attack us, Pike said. They built structures. That implies a ritual or territorial boundary, which we're not crossing. Pike nodded, but I saw her jaw tighten. The meeting ended, and people dispersed to find places to sleep. I stayed near the coil, checking the scaffolding one more time. The fasteners were holding, but the crack was still arcing every 20 seconds or so. I pulled out my scriber and marked the interval times on a nearby panel. 21 seconds, 19, 23, irregular, but not accelerating. You're counting again. I turned. Pike stood a few meters away, arms crossed. It helps me think, I said. I noticed. She walked closer. You do it when you're anxious. Count things, mark lines. I didn't respond. The coil's stable. For now, if the crack widens, we'll have bigger problems. She nodded, then pulled something from her jacket pocket. A clear sample bag. Inside was a glove, the kind we used for equipment handling. The palm and fingers were covered in a dark, wet-looking film. I collected this from one of the structures, she said, while you were working on the hull. I stared at her. Doyle said maintain distance. I used a retrieval pole. No direct contact. She held the bag up to the light. The film looked almost black, with a texture like wet leather. It doesn't evaporate, doesn't dry. I tested it with a heat probe and it remained stable up to 60 degrees. It's organic, but it's not behaving like any biological material I've seen. What do you think it is? I don't know. But it's on every one of those structures, and it's cold to the touch even when the ambient temperature should have warmed it. She tucked the bag back into her pocket. I'm going to run more tests tomorrow. I wanted to tell her to be careful, but she already knew that. Instead, I said, keep the samples contained. Of course. She left and I returned to my fastener count. 28 visible, 16 hidden. The numbers were a rhythm I could follow when everything else felt like chaos. I found a spot to sleep near the base of the scaffolding, close enough to hear if something went wrong with the coil. I used my jacket as a pillow and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about the port retrofit I'd signed off on 6 years ago. A routine structural upgrade to handle heavier cargo loads. I'd checked the welds, verified the load calculations, approved the work. 3 months later, during a storm surge, the entire platform collapsed. A deckhand named Connor Vale had been securing equipment on the lower deck when the supports gave way. They found him crushed under 2 tons of shipping containers. The inquiry cleared me. The failure was traced to substandard materials supplied by a contractor. But I knew the truth. I'd signed off on that work without checking every single fastener, every weld, every load point. I'd trusted the system instead of verifying it myself. I hadn't made that mistake since. I must have slept eventually, because I woke to the sound of movement. I opened my eyes and saw Sam Whitaker, one of the rig crew, a wiry man with permanent grease under his fingernails, standing near the coil housing. Another crew member, a woman named Bailey, stood beside him. They were both facing the scaffolding with their arms raised, hands moving through the air in slow, precise patterns. They were performing maintenance gestures, tightening phantom bolts, adjusting invisible settings, tracing cable paths with their fingers like they were reading a schematic that only they could see. I stood up. Sam! He didn't respond. Neither did Bailey. Their eyes were open, but unfocused. Their movements were perfectly synchronized. Right hand up, left hand forward, fingers curling around nothing. Outside, the drumming had started again. Low. Steady. The same rhythm as the coil's arcing discharge. I crossed the space and grabbed Sam's shoulder. Sam, wake up! He collapsed, just dropped like someone had cut his strings. Bailey did the same, both of them crumpling to the deck in unison. By the time I knelt beside them, they were blinking and confused. What happened? Sam asked. You tell me. I was sleeping. Then I was... He looked at his hands. I don't know. Pike appeared with her medical kit and a portable light. She examined them both, checking pupils and pulse. Then she took Sam's hand and turned it palm up under the light. The dark film was there. Thin black lines traced along his veins, barely visible beneath the surface. When did you touch the structures? Pike asked. I didn't, Sam said. I swear I didn't. Look at your hands. He did. Then Bailey. They both stared at the lines threading through their skin like ink in water. Pike pulled a magnifier from her kit and leaned close. When she spoke again, her voice was level, but I heard the tension beneath it. It's in your capillaries, she said, threading through the tissue. I need to take samples. How did it get there? Bailey asked. Pike didn't answer immediately. She was looking at their palms, at the small cuts and scrapes that anyone working a salvage operation accumulates. Then she checked her own hands. Intact gloves, no breaks in the skin. Microcuts, she said. Any break in the skin barrier. It entered through contact with contaminated surfaces. I thought about the tools we'd been using, the cable we'd hauled. Everything we'd salvaged from the wreck had been near those structures. Everyone needs to check their hands, I said. Now. Doyle appeared, already awake and pulling on his jacket. What's going on? I explained while Pike continued her examination. By the time I finished, half the crew was awake and gathered around us, everyone staring at their own hands in the portable light. 3 more people had the lines, faint but present. Quarantine protocols, Doyle said. Anyone with contamination stays in a separate section. No contact with the rest of the crew until we understand what we're dealing with. It's colonization, Pike said. The material is integrating with living tissue. Can you remove it? Not without causing significant damage. It's already threaded into the bloodstream. Doyle's jaw tightened. Then we contain it. No one else gets exposed. The next day, we worked in shifts. I reinforced the quarantine barrier with welded panels and a sealed airlock. Pike set up a field lab in one of the intact compartments and began running tests on the film samples. The people with the lines, Sam, Bailey, and the others, showed no symptoms beyond the visible contamination. They felt fine. They said they couldn't feel the film at all. But that night, when the drumming started again, they all rose at the same time and walked to the coil housing. Their hands moved in perfect synchronization, performing maintenance routines they'd never been trained for. The third day, Colton came to me while I was checking the hull patches. We need to consider cooperation, he said. With who? The natives, the assembly. He gestured toward the structures at the basin's perimeter. They're building something, and maybe that something includes a way off this planet. We don't know what they want. Exactly. So we should find out. He leaned against the hull plating. I'm organizing a work detail. We'll approach one of the structures, observe their methods, maybe establish some kind of communication protocol. Doyle won't approve that. I'm not asking Doyle. I'm quartermaster. Resource acquisition is my call. I looked at him. You're going to ignore a direct order. I'm going to interpret it generously. He said, maintain distance. I'm not making contact, I'm observing. Colton smiled. Come with us if you want, or stay here and count your fasteners. He walked away before I could respond. I found Doyle and told him. He ordered Colton to stand down. Colton agreed, then left with 6 crew members the next morning anyway. They were gone for 4 hours. When they returned, they were calm. Too calm. Their eyes were distant, and when they spoke, their words came out in short, synchronized bursts. Fresh, cut marks lined their forearms. The film was visible beneath their skin, coin-sized discs tracking the path of major veins. They'd brought offerings, tools, wire spools, battery cells. They placed them at the base of the nearest structure while the assembly drummed and watched. Doyle ordered them into quarantine. Colton went willingly, still smiling. They welcomed us, he said. They understand cooperation. They're building something important, and we can be part of it. What are they building? I asked. A connection between the structures and the coil. They're trying to help us. Help us how? Colton looked at me like I'd asked something obvious. They're completing the circuit. That night, I stood at the edge of our cordon and watched the assembly work. They'd expanded their ring of structures, adding more cable, more hull fragments, more pale stones. The drumming continued without pause. And in the quarantine section, 11 people swayed in unison, their hands tracing patterns in the air that matched the maintenance routines for a field coil none of them had ever been trained to operate. The camp was no longer unified. We had two groups now, those who wanted to understand what was happening and those who'd already been integrated into it. I counted the people on our side. 7, including me. 7 people, and 3 weeks of supplies, and a cracked coil that was pulling us towards something we couldn't see yet. I pulled out my scriber and marked a line on the hull plating. 1 mark for each person still standing outside the rights. 7 lines. I stared at them and wondered how long before we ran out. Pike's lab was a sealed compartment on the second deck with 1 door and no windows. She'd requisitioned a portable work surface, a handful of diagnostic tools, and every sample container we had left. When I arrived on the 4th morning, she was suspending a metal rod over a drumhead she'd fashioned from a storage container lid and a section of synthetic fabric. "Watch," she said. She'd coated the rod in the dark film. It glistened under the portable light, wet and cold-looking despite being inside a heated compartment for hours. Pike struck the drumhead with her palm, a single sharp beat. Nothing happened. She struck it again, this time sustaining a low rhythm. 1 beat per second. Steady and unchanging. The film began to move, contracting. The coating tightened around the rod like muscle fiber responding to stimulus. After 30 seconds of sustained drumming, the rod was visibly bent. Pike stopped and the film relaxed, but the rod remained curved. "It's reactive tissue," she said. "It responds to specific acoustic frequencies by contracting. The lower and steadier the frequency, the stronger the response." I stepped closer. "Show me the tissue samples." She pulled up an image on a slate, magnified cross-section of Sam Whitaker's forearm tissue. Black threads wove through capillary walls and wrapped around nerve bundles like parasitic roots. The threads were thicker than I'd expected, maybe half the diameter of a human hair, and they branched at regular intervals. "These are metallic protein filaments," Pike said. "They've integrated into his circulatory and nervous systems. When the assembly drums, these filaments contract and store electrical charge. Like a battery. Exactly like a battery, a biological capacitor." She closed the image. "Sam reported phantom sensations yesterday. He said he can hear the drumming even when it stops, a pulse in his veins that matches the coil's discharge rhythm. Can you remove them?" "Not without causing catastrophic tissue damage. They're already load-bearing structures in his bloodstream." She pulled off her gloves and leaned against the work surface. "Evan, this isn't an infection. It's conversion. They're turning people into circuit components." I thought about the synchronized gestures, the offerings, the calm expressions on the faces of those who'd been integrated. Do they know what's happening to them? Colton does. I asked him directly. He said the assembly is optimizing the system and that we should be grateful for the opportunity to participate. That's not Colton talking. "No," Pike said quietly. "It's not." I left her to her work and descended to ground level. The assembly had been busy overnight. They'd cleared a path from their ring of structures to the core section's damaged flank, a straight line through the basin, maybe 200 meters long. Cable lay across the ground in geometric patterns, forming triangular nodes every 10 meters. When I walked closer, I saw that the cables weren't just lying there. They'd been staked into the soil with bone pins, the same pale vertebrae-shaped stones that decorated the structures. I knelt and touched one of the cables. It was cold, much colder than the ambient temperature justified, and when I pulled my hand back, my glove came away clean, No film transfer. That was new. The first samples Pike had collected transferred on contact. This cable had been treated somehow, sealed or cured. I stood and looked toward the structures. The assembly was there, working in their usual silence. As I watched, they began drumming. The sound rolled across the basin like a physical wave, traveling through the ground and up into my boots. The cable at my feet vibrated slightly. Then arcs began to jump. Thin blue lines, barely visible in the daylight, leaping from one cable node to the next. They traveled down the path toward the core section, each arc landing on a triangular node and jumping to the next. When the chain reached the hull, a brighter arc shot up the damaged flank and disappeared into the coil housing. The drumming stopped. The arcs faded. I walked back to the core section and climbed to the coil level. The scaffolding was holding, but the crack had widened, maybe 2 millimeters, enough to increase the discharge frequency. I pulled out my scriber and marked the new interval. 15 seconds between arcs now. It had been 20 when we crashed. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Bailey stood at the scaffold's base, her hands at her sides. The coin-sized discs beneath her skin had multiplied. I counted 7 on her left arm alone, each one tracking a major vein from wrist to shoulder. "You shouldn't be up here," I said. "I wanted to help." Her voice was flat, like someone had turned down her effect and left only the functional parts. "The captain ordered quarantine. The captain doesn't understand what we're building." "What are you building?" She looked at the coil, then at me. "A connection. Between the power source and the network. The discharge is unstable. We're smoothing it, making it safe." "Safe for who?" "Everyone." She turned and walked away. No wasted motion. I finished my inspection and descended. When I reached the ground level, I found Sam Whitaker near the supply cache. He was placing a portable welder at the base of the nearest structure. An offering, like the others. His forearms were covered in the discs now, and when he reached up to adjust the welder's position, I saw something new. Bone buds. Small white nodules rising along his sternum, visible through his open shirt. They formed a parallel line to his ribs, like a secondary cage growing beneath the first. "Sam," I said. He looked at me. His eyes were clear but distant. "Foster, how do you feel?" "Fine. Better than fine." He pressed his palm against the structure's cable. "I can feel the current when it moves through the network. It's like music, but physical. In my bones." "You're not fine. Look at your chest." He glanced down at the bone buds, then back at me. "Growing pains. We're adapting." "To what?" "The system." He smiled. It wasn't Colton's easy smile. It was something else. Satisfied. Complete. "You should join us, Foster. You understand structures. You'd make an excellent node." I backed away and returned to the core section. Doyle was waiting near the airlock we'd installed for quarantine separation. "How many now?" he asked. 11 with visible contamination, 3 more showing early signs. I pulled out my slate and showed him the count. "We're down to 7 clean. We need to contain this. It's past containment. The film is on every surface we've salvaged. Every tool, every cable, every piece of hull plating. Anyone who's been working outside has been exposed." Doyle's jaw tightened. "Then we limit outside work. Essential repairs only." "Captain, that's not enough. The assembly is building something, and our people are becoming part of it. We need to understand what we're dealing with before—" A sound cut me off. A crash, followed by shouting. We ran to the source. One of the crew, a man named Ellis, who'd been on the uncontaminated list yesterday, had collapsed during a meal. He lay on the deck, rigid and shaking. His eyes were open and unfocused. His jaw was locked, teeth grinding together hard enough that I could hear enamel cracking. Pike appeared with her medical kit and dropped beside him. She checked his pulse, then his eyes. When she turned his head, I saw it. A black line crawling from his ear canal onto the deck plating, moving independently like a flatworm seeking moisture. It was maybe 3 millimeters wide and growing longer as I watched. Pike grabbed a sample container and positioned it near the line. The thing changed direction, moving toward the container like it could sense the opening. When it was halfway in, Pike sealed the lid and pulled away. Ellis stopped shaking. His jaw relaxed and he blinked, confused. "What happened?" he asked. Pike didn't answer. She held the container up to the light. The black line inside was still moving, pressing against the transparent walls, searching for metal. "When did you last work outside?" she asked Ellis. "This morning. I was securing anchor points near the aft section." "Did you touch any of the assembly's cables?" "No, I stayed clear like we were told." "But you handled our cables, the ones we salvaged." He nodded. Pike looked at me, and I saw it in her face. The realization we'd both been avoiding. Everything outside was contaminated, every tool, every surface, every piece of equipment we'd touched since the crash. The film had been spreading through our salvage operation from day one, and we'd been carrying it back into the core section on our gloves, our boots, our hands. We were already inside the network. We just hadn't been activated yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat near the coil housing with my slate and began mapping. I plotted every structure the assembly had built, noting their positions relative to the core section. Then I overlaid the cable paths they'd laid and the positions where contaminated crew members stood during rites. The pattern was obvious once I drew it out. The structures formed a ring of nodes equidistant from the coil. The cable paths radiated outward from the core like spokes on a wheel. The contaminated crew members positioned themselves at specific points along the cables, always at the triangular nodes, always facing inward toward the coil. When the coil discharged, the arcs traveled through the hull into the cable network. The structures flashed with secondary discharges, and the crew members swayed, their bodies absorbing and redistributing the energy. I measured the distances, calculated the spacing, checked the discharge intervals against the timing of the rites. It was a circuit. A massive biological and mechanical circuit using the coil as a power source, the structures as distribution nodes, and human bodies as organic capacitors. The assembly wasn't worshipping the coil. They were regulating it, using flesh and bone to smooth out the dangerous, irregular discharge that could kill everyone in the basin if it reached critical overload. And we'd been helping them build it. I found Pike in her lab and showed her the calculations. She studied them in silence, then looked up at me. The bone growths, structural anchors to handle increased current capacity, and the metallic filaments, conductive pathways, turning tissue into wire. I set the slate down. This isn't ritual, it's engineering. The rites are operational procedures. The drumming provides the frequency that activates the filaments. The synchronized movements are maintenance routines. Then the assembly, they're technicians, and they've been building power regulation systems around geological features for generations. To them, our crashed ship is just another energy source that needs to be integrated into their existing network. Pike sat down heavily. Colton was right. They are completing the circuit, and everyone who's contaminated is already part of it. Can we break it? We'd need to remove the coil, take it somewhere the assembly can't reach, isolate it from the network. How? I thought about it. We had one functioning cargo walker, an exoskeleton frame designed for moving heavy equipment. It could drag the coil if we rigged it properly. There was a basalt shelf about 1 kilometer northwest, elevated enough to break line of sight with the structures. I can do it, I said, but we'll need to move fast. Once we start, the assembly will respond. So will our people. We gathered the uncontaminated crew, 7 of us now, including Doyle, and explained the plan. The captain approved it immediately. We had maybe 6 hours before the assembly's next major rite, based on the pattern Pike and I had observed. That gave us a narrow window to prep the walker, rig the coil for transport, and haul it out of the basin before they noticed. I spent 2 hours on the rigging. The coil weighed approximately 4,000 kilograms, manageable for the walker, but only if the load was balanced correctly. I used every cable and anchor bolt we had left, creating a harness that distributed weight across 6 attachment points. The walker itself was in decent shape. Someone had already charged its batteries and tested the servos. I climbed into the frame and ran a systems check. All green. Pike and 2 others helped me position the walker beneath the coil housing. I extended the lift arms and locked them into place, then began the careful process of disconnecting the coil from its damaged scaffolding. Each bolt I removed brought us closer to mobility and closer to total system failure if something went wrong. The last bolt came free, and the coil settled into the harness with a deep, resonant thunk that I felt through the walker's frame. I checked the load indicators, 4,200 kilograms, within tolerance. "Clear the path," I said. Pike and the others moved away. I engaged the walker's servos and took 1 step forward. The coil moved with me, suspended in the harness, swaying slightly but stable. Another step, then another. I was 5 meters from the core section when they appeared. Colton stood at the entrance we'd cut in the damaged flank, flanked by Bailey, Sam, and 8 others. All of them contaminated. All of them staring at the coil with expressions I couldn't read. "Stop," Colton said. I kept walking. "Foster, you'll destabilize the entire network. The coil needs to remain connected. The coil needs to be away from you. We're trying to help. The discharge is reaching critical mass. Without regulation, it will kill everyone within 200 meters when it overloads. Then we'll take it somewhere it can't hurt anyone." Colton shook his head. "You don't understand. The assembly offered us integration. They're including us in something larger than individual survival. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have." He stepped forward. The others followed, forming a line between me and the path out of the basin. "The coil stays. We complete the circuit. Everyone survives." "As what? Components?" "As part of a community." Colton's voice was calm, reasonable. "You're a structural engineer, Foster. You understand systems. You know that the strongest structures distribute load across multiple points. That's all this is. Distributed load-bearing." I looked past him at the others. Sam's bone buds had multiplied. He had a full secondary ribcage now, visible through his open shirt. Bailey's arms were striped with discs from wrist to shoulder. Ellis had black threads emerging from both ears, moving slowly like antennae seeking signal. They weren't human anymore. Not entirely. They were transitioning into something else, and they'd accepted it. I reversed the walker and tried to circle around them. They matched my movement, maintaining the line. More contaminated crew emerged from the core section. People I'd thought were still in quarantine. 15 now, then 20. "Put the coil back, Foster," Colton said. "We'll show you it's safe. You can join us, feel what we feel." "I don't want to feel it." "You will eventually. Everyone will. The film is already in your system. You've been exposed dozens of times. You just haven't been activated yet." I looked at Pike. She stood with Doyle and the other uncontaminated crew near the supply cache, too far away to help. She met my eyes and I saw the same calculation I was making. We were outnumbered, and the people blocking my path were stronger than they should be. The filaments weren't just conductive. They were enhancing muscle response. I could try to force through. The walker had enough power to push them aside, but that would mean running over people I'd worked with for 3 years. People who'd survived a crash that should have killed them. People who thought they were helping. Or I could retreat. Put the coil back. Accept that we'd lost this round and start planning something else. I chose retreat. Backed the walker into the core section and lowered the coil back onto its damaged scaffolding. When the weight was off the harness, I shut down the walker and climbed out. Colton smiled. "Thank you. I'm not doing this for you. I know. You're doing it because you're calculating odds and trying to fix a problem. That's what you do." He gestured to the others. "Help him secure the coil. We don't want it falling." They moved forward, and I realized I had no choice but to work alongside them. We rebuilt the scaffolding together, contaminated and clean, working side by side. They didn't speak except to coordinate lift points. When we finished, the coil was more stable than it had been before I'd tried to move it. Pike approached as they dispersed. "We need a new plan, a harder one." I looked at the coil, then at the crew members walking back toward the assembly's structures. Their bodies were changing faster now. The integration was accelerating. Soon, there wouldn't be anyone left who hadn't been converted. "We can't move it," I said. "They won't let us." Then what? I thought about Connor Vale, the deckhand who died under shipping containers 6 years ago because I'd trusted a system instead of verifying every component myself. I'd spent years trying to prevent another failure like that. Years believing that if I just worked hard enough, controlled enough variables, I could fix anything. But some systems can't be fixed. Some systems can only be ended. "We destroy it," I said. Pike stared at me. "The coil?" "Everything, the coil, the structures, the circuit, we sever it completely. That will kill anyone who's fully integrated. Their bodies are load-bearing parts of the network now. If we cut the power..." I pulled out my slate and began sketching. The basin has a drainage feature, a brine trench running through its center. If we can tip the coil into the trench, the salt water will short the entire system. The discharge will travel through the water and back up through the cable network. It'll be catastrophic, but contained. You'll need to re-rig the anchor points, aim the collapse, and timing. You'll need to trigger it during a write, when everyone's connected. Yes. Evan. She put her hand on my arm. Some of them won't survive the discharge. I know, I said again. She nodded slowly. Then we'd better get started. But we didn't get started, because that night Colton disabled the welds on the quarantine barrier and opened the sealed sections. By morning, he'd led a shared write that pulled 6 more crew into the network. The contaminated outnumbered the clean 2-to-1 now, and the assembly had expanded their work again. New cables ran from their structures directly into the core section, entering through gaps we'd meant to seal. The path was no longer outside. It was inside. Running through our shelter, connecting to the coil housing, turning our only refuge into part of their machine. I stood at the edge of the camp and watched people I'd known for years kneel in the cable trenches while the assembly drummed. They swayed together. Their hands traced patterns in the air. Their faces were calm and empty. Pike found me there at dawn. She didn't say anything, just stood beside me and looked at what we'd become. 7 people left. 7 people who hadn't been integrated. 7 people who understood that the thing growing around us wasn't salvation. It was transformation into something that would keep us alive but take everything that made us human. I pulled out my scriber and started planning where to place the anchor bolts for a controlled collapse. The numbers were brutal. The casualty count would be high. But staying meant becoming part of the machine, and I'd rather die trying to break it than live as a component within it. Pike watched me work. After a while, she said, "The port accident, the one you don't talk about." I kept sketching. "What about it?" "You could have condemned the structure, forced an evacuation." "Yes. Why didn't you?" I stopped drawing and looked at the coil, at the cables running through our camp, at the people kneeling in the trenches. Because I thought I could fix it. And now? Now I know better. She nodded and walked away. I returned to my calculations, counting anchor points and load distributions, marking the places where cable would need to be cut and where the remaining attitude jets could be positioned to shear the core section's supports at the precise moment of maximum write activity. The math was clear. The cost was clear. Some systems can only be ended. I just had to choose to be the one who ended this one. The storms arrived on the 6th day. I was on the basin's rim, driving anchor bolts into basalt, when the first one rolled over the ridges. The sky turned the color of old bruises. purple-black with veins of pale green. The wind picked up, carrying grit that stung exposed skin. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. I had 4 bolts left to place. Each one needed to be positioned precisely, 30 degrees apart in a circle around the point where I planned to tip the core section. The bolts would hold winch lines that would control the direction of the collapse. Get the angle wrong, and the coil would miss the trench entirely. Pike climbed up to join me, carrying a spool of cable over her shoulder. She set it down and looked at the storm. "How long do we have?" she asked. "An hour, maybe less." I positioned the next bolt and triggered the pneumatic driver. It sank into the rock with a sound like breaking teeth. We worked in silence, unreeling cable from the spool and threading it through the anchor points. The wind grew stronger. The strap lines holding the core section's temporary bracing began to sing. A high, thin note that cut through the air like a blade. Below us, the assembly's drumming intensified. They'd gathered in their largest formation yet, maybe 50 figures arranged in concentric rings around the structures. I secured the last cable and checked the tension. All 4 lines were taut and properly seated. When the time came, I'd trigger the remaining attitude jets, small thrusters originally meant for orbital maneuvering, to shear these lines simultaneously and tip the core section forward into the trench. Pike handed me the winch control. Her fingers brushed mine, and I saw it. Black threads emerging from the corners of her eyes, moving slowly like cracks spreading through ice. "How long?" I asked. She knew what I meant. 2 days. Maybe 3. It entered through my ears during the last rite when I pulled Sam free. I've been managing the symptoms, but it's in my brainstem now. Can you slow it? No. She pulled her hand back and wiped at the threads. They smeared across her cheekbone like wet ink. I can feel it threading through my skull. When the drumming starts, I want to go to them. I want to kneel in the trenches and let the current flow through me. But you're still here. Pike nodded slowly. The threads had reached her jawline now, branching like river deltas across her skin. The storm hit at dusk. Rain came sideways, cold and sharp. Lightning walked across the ridges in branching patterns. The coil's discharge accelerated, arcs jumping every 8 seconds now, lighting up the interior of the core section with blue-white flashes. I was checking the attitude jet connections when they found me. I'd gone to the outer wreckage to salvage control modules, small units that would let me trigger all 4 jets simultaneously from a single remote. The aft section lay nose down in a crater, its hull cracked open like an egg. I climbed inside and worked by portable light, disconnecting modules and testing circuits. When I came out, they were waiting. The assembly formed the outer ring, 40 or more standing in perfect silence despite the wind and rain. Colton and the converted crew formed the inner ring. 23 people now, more than 2/3 of the survivors. Their faces were calm. Water ran down their skin in sheets, but they didn't blink or wipe it away. "Foster," Colton said, "we need to talk about what you're planning." I set the modules down carefully, keeping my hands visible. "I'm not planning anything. You've been placing anchor bolts, running cables, testing the jets." He stepped forward. Water dripped from his hair, plastering it to his skull. The bone buds on his chest had multiplied. He had a full external rib cage now, white ridges pressing against his skin like the bars of a cage growing outward. "We know what you're going to do. Then you know you should let me do it." "We can't. The network is nearly complete. Breaking it now will kill everyone who's integrated." "You're not integrated, you're colonized." "There's no difference." Colton gestured to the others. "We're part of something larger now. A system that works. A community that survives together. You're components in a machine. So are you. So is everyone. The only difference is we've accepted it." The assembly began drumming. The sound rolled through the rain like distant thunder. I felt it in my boots, traveling up through bone and settling in my chest. The converted crew swayed. Their hands rose in unison, tracing maintenance patterns in the air. I tried to back away. Sam and Bailey moved to block the path. Ellis appeared on my left, his ears trailing black filaments that whipped in the wind like antennae. More crew closed in from the right. "Don't make this difficult," Colton said. "We're trying to help you understand." "I understand fine." "Then you know we're offering you a place, a role in the system." He pulled a length of braided cable from his belt. The assembly had prepared it, treated the surface. It glistened in the portable light, wet and dark. "You're a structural engineer, Foster. You understand load distribution. You'd make a perfect conductor." "I don't want to be a conductor. It's not about want, it's about function." Colton moved closer. The others matched his movement, tightening the circle. "The system needs a central node, someone to stabilize the network and anchor the primary flows. That's you. We've already prepared the connections." I grabbed for the control modules. Bailey kicked them away. Sam caught my arm and twisted it behind my back. I tried to break free, but Ellis grabbed my other arm, and between them they forced me to my knees. Colton knelt in front of me. He held up the cable. "This won't hurt. You'll feel the connection, then the relief, like setting down weight you've been carrying for years. Let me go. Soon." He pressed the cable against my left forearm and dragged it down. The braided strands scored my skin enough to open the surface. Blood welled up, and the dark film that coated the cable flooded the wound instantly. I felt it thread through my flesh, like something pushing through muscle and wrapping around bone. The filaments spread fast, branching along vessels and nerves, seeking pathways. Within seconds they reached my elbow. My hand twitched involuntarily. Colton scored my right arm. More film. More filaments. They met at my chest and began weaving together, forming a network that pulsed in time with the coil's discharge. The drumming grew louder. I wanted to stand, wanted to walk to the structures, wanted to kneel in the trenches and let the current flow through me, because that was my function, my purpose, my role in the system that kept everyone alive and safe and connected. The pain cut through the compulsion. "Stop fighting it," Colton said. He was smiling. "You're already part of us. You just need to accept it." The assembly's eldest member approached. Its chest was covered in concentric scar rings from decades of drumming. It pressed a palm coated in film against my forehead. I felt the filaments thread through my skull and wrap around my brainstem. My hands began to move without permission. Tracing patterns, maintenance routines for systems I'd never studied. My knees locked and my spine straightened, and I was kneeling facing the core section where the coil needed my body to smooth its discharge and distribute its load and complete the circuit. The cutting torch ignited behind me with a sharp hiss. Pike swung it in a wide arc. The assembly scattered. The converted crew pulled back. Sam and Ellis released my arms and I collapsed forward, hands on the wet ground. Pike grabbed my collar and hauled me upright. "Run!" I ran. My legs moved mechanically, the filaments already trying to override my motor control. I counted steps to keep my mind focused. We reached the ridge before they caught up. Pike turned and fired the torch again, keeping them at bay. They didn't pursue aggressively, just maintained pressure, herding us away from the aft section and toward the rim. We climbed. The slope was steep and slick with rain. My arms burned where the cables had scored them. I could feel the filaments threading deeper, reaching toward my heart. When I looked down at my forearms, I saw coin-sized discs already forming beneath the skin. Pike climbed beside me. The black threads covered half her face now, branching across her cheeks and forehead like tattoos drawn by a shaking hand. When she glanced at me, her pupils were dilated and unfocused. "I can hear them," she said. "The drumming. It's inside my head. Keep climbing. I want to go back." "No, you don't." "Yes, I do. I want to kneel in the trenches. I want to feel the current." She stopped climbing and looked down at the camp. "It's in my motor cortex now. In another hour, I won't be able to resist." I grabbed her arm. "Then we have an hour." To do what? Finish what we started. We reached the top of the ridge as the storm peaked. Lightning struck the basin's center, hitting one of the assembly's structures. The cable network lit up like a circuit diagram, every connection glowing briefly before fading. The converted crew in the trenches went rigid, their bodies conducting the discharge. When the light faded, they collapsed. Then they stood up again, moving in perfect synchronization. Pike and I reached the anchor point where I'd positioned the remote trigger. The device sat in a waterproof case, its indicator lights showing green across all 4 jet connections. I checked the cable tensions. Still good. The angle of collapse was still viable. When? Pike asked. The next right, when everyone's connected. Maximum integration means maximum discharge when the system shorts. Some of them will die. I know. She looked at me. The threads had reached her hairline, disappearing into her scalp like roots. You're sure this is the right choice? No, but it's the only choice left. She nodded and pulled a small data chip from her pocket. My research, everything I learned about the film, the filaments, the integration process. If anyone ever finds this place, they'll need to know what happened. I took the chip and clipped it to my belt. Evan? She gripped my arm. When the discharge hits, it'll travel through anyone who's integrated. That includes me. And you now. I looked at the discs on my forearms. They'd multiplied while we climbed. 8 on my left arm, 6 on my right. The filaments were still spreading, weaving through tissue. The salt water might dissolve them, I said. When the coil shorts into the trench, the current will travel through the brine and back up through the network. High salinity should break down the organic components of the film. And if it doesn't? Then we die with the system we helped build. Pike released my arm and stepped back. I need to go down there. What? I can feel it pulling me, the compulsion. I can't fight it much longer. She looked at the camp. When you trigger the collapse, I'll be in the trenches with the others. If the discharge frees me, I'll find you. If it doesn't, Lauren, you need to let me go. I'm becoming one of them. In another hour, I'll try to stop you, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to be the reason you fail. I wanted to argue, wanted to find some solution that kept her here, kept her separate from the network, kept her human. But the threads were crawling across her face, and I could see her fighting to stay still. Fighting not to turn and run back down to the camp where the drumming called and the current needed her. Go, I said. She nodded once and started down the slope. I watched her descend, moving faster as the compulsion took over. By the time she reached the bottom, she was running. She went straight to the nearest trench and knelt beside Colton. Her hands rose and began tracing patterns in the air. I turned away and checked the remote trigger again. All systems ready. I just needed to wait for the right moment. The storm rolled on. Lightning struck twice more, each time lighting up the network. The coil's discharge accelerated further, arcs every 5 seconds now. Critical overload was maybe 6 hours away. If I didn't act soon, the system would kill everyone anyway. I counted the anchor bolts, counted the cable strands, counted my breaths. The numbers kept my mind clear, kept the filaments from taking full control. I could feel them threading through my chest now, wrapping around my ribs. My hands wanted to move, wanted to trace patterns. I forced them to stay still by gripping the remote trigger. Below, the assembly expanded their rings. More cables were laid. More connections made. The converted crew moved between trenches, adjusting positions, optimizing the network. Pike knelt among them, her face turned toward the coil. I waited until full dark. Until the right reached its peak activity. Until every converted crew member was in position and the assembly's drumming hit its lowest, most sustained frequency. Then I armed the jets. 4 indicators turned from green to amber. I had 30 seconds before auto-abort. I used 25 of them to make sure the cables were still properly tensioned and the collapse angle was correct. Then I used the last 5 to think about Connor Vale. about the choice I didn't make, about the structure I tried to fix instead of condemning. I pressed the trigger. The attitude jets fired with a sound like ripping metal. The core section shuddered. The anchor cables snapped altogether, severed by shaped charges I'd positioned at each bolt point. The entire structure tilted forward, grinding across stone with a noise that drowned out the drumming. For a moment, it hung suspended, balanced on its keel. Then gravity took over and it toppled. The coil hit the brine trench with a concussive boom that I felt in my bones. Water exploded upward in a column that reached halfway to where I stood. The coil discharged. A sheet of white light raced through the water. It traveled faster than anything should move, jumping from the trench into the cable network in a single, brilliant instant. The structures lit up like they'd been struck by lightning. The cables glowed. The trenches became rivers of light, and the people conducting the current, the converted crew, the assembly members, everyone who'd been integrated into the network, went rigid. I was thrown backward by the concussive wave. My arms burned where the filaments conducted residual current. The discs beneath my skin heated until I thought they'd cook me from the inside out. Then the heat faded, and I felt the filaments dissolve, breaking apart into fragments that my body could absorb or expel. I lost consciousness for a time. Seconds or minutes. I couldn't tell. When I came to, the drumming had stopped. The night was silent except for the rain and the crackle of cooling metal from the trench where the coil had sunk. I stood on legs that barely held me and looked down at the basin. Bodies lay scattered in the trenches. Some moved, some didn't. I descended. The slope was treacherous with mud and rubble. I fell twice, tearing open my palms on sharp rock. When I reached the bottom, I went straight to the nearest trench. Colton lay on his back, eyes open and unseeing. The external ribcage on his chest had cracked during the discharge, white bone protruding through burned skin. He wasn't breathing. Bailey was 3 meters away. Dead. The discs on her arms had burst during the discharge, leaving coin-sized craters in her flesh. Sam Whitaker sat against a structure's base, alive but unresponsive. His chest rose and fell. His eyes tracked my movement but showed no recognition. I found Ellis near the core section's collapsed base. He was conscious and trying to stand. I helped him up. He leaned against me. "What happened?" he asked. "We ended it." I moved through the trenches, checking bodies. 11 dead, 9 freed but damaged, 3 still unconscious. I found Pike last. She lay near the center trench, curled on her side. The black threads covering her face had dissolved, leaving silver scar tissue like lace across her cheeks and forehead. When I knelt beside her, she opened her eyes. She tried to speak. No sound came out. I lifted her head carefully and saw the damage. The filaments had been in her vocal cords when the discharge hit. The tissue was scarred beyond function. She gripped my hand and nodded once, alive, damaged, but freed. I helped her sit up. Together we watched the others wake. Watched Doyle, the captain who I'd thought was gone, emerge from the wreckage and begin organizing survivors. Watched the uncontaminated crew members descend from wherever they'd been hiding and start performing triage. 14 survivors total, less than half of what we'd started with. The rain continued, the storm passed. By dawn, the basin was quiet. We salvaged what we could from the wreckage and relocated to the ridges. The core section was gone, buried under layered silt and cable at the bottom of the trench. Our only shelter was torn fabric strung between rocks. Our only warmth was body heat and chemical stoves. I found the lifeboat radio in the aft section, still functional, still charged. I carried it to the highest point on the rim and set up the antenna. The beacon began broadcasting on the Commonwealth emergency frequency, narrow band, low power. If anyone was listening, they'd hear it. If anyone was close enough, they'd come. Pike sat beside me while I worked. She couldn't speak, so she wrote on a slate. "How long?" I looked at the solar stack powering the beacon. Months, maybe years if the weather stays clear. And if no one comes, then we learn to survive here. She nodded and wrote again. You made the right choice. I wasn't sure about that. I'd kept people alive, but I'd killed others doing it. I'd destroyed our only shelter and our only chance at powered rescue. I'd condemned us to an indefinite wait in the open, hoping someone would hear our signal before we ran out of food or succumbed to exposure or lost the will to keep going. But I hadn't let us become components in a machine. I'd broken the system that was using us. That had to count for something. 3 days later, the assembly returned. I saw them first, standing at the basin's edge, looking down at the trench. They gathered in their usual rows, silent and still. Then they began building. New structures rose over the submerged coil. Smaller than before, made from fragments they'd salvaged from the water, pieces of the core shell, stone pins, vertebrae-shaped rocks. When they finished, they began drumming. The sound rolled up from the basin and across the ridges. Pike and I stood at the camp's edge and watched. The others gathered behind us, Doyle, Ellis, Sam, everyone who'd survived. They're rebuilding it, Doyle said. Will they come for us? I looked at my arms. The discs had dissolved, but the scars remained. Silver bands where the filaments had threaded deepest. I could still feel phantom sensations sometimes. A pulse in my veins that matched the rhythm of distant drumming. I don't think so, I said. We're not part of their network anymore. We're just here. The drumming continued. The assembly worked through the day and into the night. By the time they finished, they'd raised a new shrine over the trench. Smaller, quieter, but unmistakably the same kind of structure they'd built before. The machine I'd broken was being rebuilt, with or without us, and we'd spend however long we had left on this world, watching them complete what we'd interrupted. I pulled out my scriber and marked a line on the antenna mast. 1 mark for each day we'd survived. 1 mark for each day we'd choose to keep surviving, even knowing that the system we'd escaped was still here, still growing, still calling to anyone who'd listen. Pike touched my arm and pointed at the beacon. The indicator light was green. Broadcasting, waiting for someone to hear. I nodded and set the scriber down. Then I turned my back on the basin and walked into the camp to help organize the next supply run. We'd chosen survival. Now we had to live with everything that choice had cost. The first week was triage and inventory. We counted what we had left. 43 ration packs, enough for maybe 10 days if we stretched them. 12 liters of clean water. 3 chemical stoves. 1 medical kit with most of its contents used. The radio, the solar stack, and tools I'd salvaged from the wreckage before the collapse. We counted the survivors, 14 people. 6 with permanent damage from the discharge. Pike's destroyed vocal cords, Sam's unresponsive left side. Ellis with tremors he couldn't control. 8 relatively intact, including me and Doyle. We counted the dead, Colton and 10 others. We buried them in shallow graves on the ridge, marked with stones. Doyle said words. I didn't listen. I was counting the rows of rocks we'd laid, making sure each grave was positioned so rainwater would drain away instead of pooling. The camp was 4 tarps stretched between rock formations, open on 3 sides. We slept close together for warmth. When it rained, water ran through gaps in the fabric and pooled beneath us. We learned to sleep at an angle, heads uphill. The assembly worked below us in the basin. Their drumming carried up the slope every morning and evening. We learned to ignore it the way you learn to ignore persistent pain by building your life around it. On the 8th day, we ran a supply sortie to the aft section. I took Ellis and 2 others, Davis and Cohen, both uncontaminated, both still capable of hauling equipment. We descended at dawn, moving quietly past the trench where the coil lay submerged. The assembly watched us but didn't interfere. They'd completed their new shrine overnight, a structure half the size of the original network, built from salvaged cable and hull fragments pulled from the water. The aft section had been picked over by previous salvage runs, but there were compartments we hadn't reached yet. I pried open a sealed storage bay and found emergency supplies someone had stashed before the crash. Water purification tablets, protein bars, a box of thermal blankets still in their packaging. "How long will this last?" Davis asked. I did the math. 14 people, existing supplies, new supplies. 3 weeks, maybe 4. And after that, we forage or we don't. We loaded the supplies into packs and started back. I was climbing past the trench when I saw movement in the water. The coil was still down there, 20 meters below the surface. The brine was clear enough that I could see its outline, a massive cylinder wrapped in torn shielding. But something else was moving around it. Long, eel-like shapes, swimming in slow circles. Native life. The basin had aquatic species we hadn't encountered before. They seemed drawn to the coil's residual electromagnetic field, clustering around the crack where the discharge had been strongest. "Foster," Ellis said. "We should go." I marked the position on my mental map, possible food source if we got desperate, and kept climbing. Pike was waiting at the camp when we returned. She'd been organizing the medical supplies, inventorying what we had left to treat infections and injuries. When she saw me, she held up her slate. "Sam's getting worse." I found Sam in the shelter, lying on a thermal blanket. The left side of his body was completely unresponsive now. His face had started to droop. When he saw me, he tried to speak. The words came out slurred. "Can't feel arm." Pike wrote on her slate and showed it to me. "Stroke during the discharge. Filament dissolution caused clots." "Can you treat it?" She shook her head. I sat beside Sam and checked his vitals the way Pike had taught me. Pulse, breathing, pupil response. Everything was declining. He had days, maybe. There was nothing we could do. "Sorry," I said. Sam tried to smile. It came out crooked. "Not your fault." But it was. I triggered the discharge knowing people would die. Knowing the integrated crew would suffer catastrophic damage when the filaments dissolved. I'd made that choice. Sam was paying for it. I stayed with him until he fell asleep, then found Doyle near the beacon. The captain was checking the antenna connections, making sure the storm hadn't loosened anything. He looked older than he had before the crash. Grey had spread through his hair, and lines had deepened around his eyes. "How's Sam?" he asked. "Dying." Doyle nodded. He'd known. We all had. "Anyone else showing symptoms?" "Not yet." "Will there be more?" "Probably. The filaments were in their brainstems. Pike says long-term neurological damage is likely." Doyle tightened a bolt on the antenna base. "How long before someone hears the beacon?" "No way to know. We're broadcasting on Commonwealth emergency frequency, but we don't know where we are or if there are any ships within range." I pulled out my scriber and used it to scrape dried mud from the solar stack's surface. Could be days. Could be never. He finished with the bolt and stood. "I've been thinking about what you did, destroying the coil, killing those people." I kept scraping mud. And it was the right call. The only call. He looked down at the basin where the Assembly's new shrine stood over the submerged coil. "But it doesn't make it easy to live with." "No." "Does it get easier? Living with choices like that?" I thought about Connor Vale, about the port structure I'd tried to fix instead of condemning, about the 6 years I'd spent believing that if I just worked harder, controlled more variables, I could prevent every disaster. "No," I said. "It doesn't get easier. You just learn to carry it." Doyle walked away. I finished cleaning the solar stack and checked the beacon's output. Still broadcasting. Still waiting. Pike found me there as the sun set. She sat beside me and wrote on her slate. "You count things when you're anxious. Fasteners. Load points. Days. Helps me think." What are you thinking about now? I looked at the basin. The assembly had lit fires around their shrine, small flames that guttered in the wind. They weren't using our salvaged materials anymore. They'd moved to local resources, dried reeds, animal fat, stones from the ridges. I'm thinking about how long we can survive here if no one comes, I said. How long before we run out of food? How long before someone else has a stroke or an infection we can't treat? How long before we're down to 2 people, then 1, then none? Stop. Why? It's what's going to happen if we don't get rescued. She grabbed my arm and pointed at my forearm. The scars from the cables were still visible, silver bands where the filaments had burned through when they dissolved. She traced them with her finger, then pointed at her own face. The silver lace patterns across her cheeks and forehead. Then she wrote, "We're still here. That's what matters." Is it? We're stranded. We have no shelter, no sustainable food source, no way to know if anyone's even listening to the beacon. We're alive. For now. She hit me hard enough to get my attention. Then she wrote furiously, "You made a choice. You chose to break the machine instead of becoming part of it. You chose to give us a chance to stay human. Stop counting the cost and start accepting what you bought." I read it twice. Then I looked at her damaged face, her scarred throat, her hands that shook slightly when she wrote. "What did I buy?" I asked. She wrote one word: time. Sam died on the 10th day. We buried him next to Colton and the others. Davis said words about service and sacrifice. I marked his grave with a flat stone and scratched his name into it with my scriber. That night I couldn't sleep. I left the shelter and climbed to the beacon. The antenna stood against the stars, its light blinking steadily. 1 pulse every 3 seconds, a rhythm I'd started counting unconsciously. Pike joined me after a while. She couldn't sleep either. We sat in silence watching the assembly's fires burn in the basin below. She wrote, "Do you regret it?" "Which part?" "Destroying the coil." I thought about it, really thought about it. Not the immediate answer, but the true one. "No," I said. "I regret that people died. I regret that we're stranded. I regret that you can't speak, and Sam's dead, and we're all scarred in ways that won't heal. But I don't regret ending the system that was using us." "Good." "Why good?" She wrote, "Because you finally chose to end something instead of trying to fix it. You let go of control, that's what you needed to learn." Feels like I learned it too late. Maybe, but you learned it. We sat there until dawn. When the sun rose, I marked another line on the antenna mast. Day 10. 10 days of surviving what I'd chosen. The 11th day brought rain. The 12th brought wind strong enough to tear one of our tarps. The 13th brought nothing, just empty sky and the distant drumming from below. On the 14th day, Ellis collapsed. He'd been showing symptoms for days: tremors, slurred speech, difficulty walking. Pike had tried to manage it, but there was only so much she could do with what we had. When he fell, he didn't get back up. We carried him to the shelter. He was conscious but confused, asking where we were and why we'd left the hearth. I held his hand while Pike checked his vitals. When she looked at me and shook her head, I understood. Another clot. Another casualty of the discharge. Ellis died that evening. 12 survivors left. I marked his grave and walked back to the beacon. The indicator light was still blinking, still broadcasting, still waiting for someone who might never come. Doyle found me there after midnight. "We need to talk about rationing," he said. "We're down to 8 days of food, less if anyone else gets sick. There are edible plants in the ridges. Pike identified them before she lost her voice. We could supplement the rations if we harvest carefully." Then we harvest. Foster. He sat beside me. "I need you to be honest. What are our actual chances of rescue?" I looked at the beacon. Did the math. We're broadcasting on a standard emergency frequency. Range is limited, maybe 50,000 kilometers in optimal conditions. If a Commonwealth ship is searching for us, and if they're within range, and if they're actively scanning emergency bands, they'll hear us. That's a lot of ifs. How long do we wait before we accept that no one's coming? I didn't have an answer for that. The beacon could broadcast for months, maybe years, as long as the solar stack held out. But how long could we survive? How many more people would we bury before we admitted that waiting was just another way of dying slowly? I don't know, I said. Doyle nodded and stood to leave. Then he turned back. For what it's worth, you made the right call. With the coil, I wouldn't have had the courage. It wasn't courage, it was mathematics. The system was going to kill us all eventually. I just chose when. Still took courage. He left. I stayed at the beacon, counting pulses. 1 every 3 seconds, 20 per minute, 1,200 per hour, 28,800 per day. Time measured in light and silence, and the hope that someone, somewhere, was listening. 3 weeks became 4. 4 became 5. We established routines. Morning water collection from a spring we'd found in the rocks. Midday foraging for the tough, fibrous plants Pike had identified as safe. Evening ration distribution and equipment maintenance. Night watches to keep the fires burning and monitor the assembly's activity below. The survivors adapted. Davis learned to set snares for the small animals that lived in the ridges, rabbit-like creatures with 6 legs and mottled grey fur. Cohen became our primary forager, memorizing which plants were edible and which would make you sick. Doyle maintained the beacon with an obsessive focus that reminded me of myself. Pike and I worked together on everything. She couldn't speak, but she didn't need to. We'd developed a shorthand of gestures and expressions that communicated more than words. When she pointed at the medical kit, I knew she was asking about supplies. When she touched my arm, I knew she was reminding me to eat. When she sat beside me at night and wrote nothing on her slate, I knew she was just keeping me company. The scars on my forearms faded from silver to pale grey. The phantom pulse I'd felt in my veins after the discharge disappeared. But sometimes, when the assembly drummed below, I felt an echo of it, a memory of connection that my body hadn't entirely forgotten. On the 37th day, something changed. I was checking the beacon's connections when I noticed the power draw had increased slightly, enough to register on the monitoring slate. I traced the circuits and found the cause. A secondary transmission had activated. Someone was responding to our beacon. I called Doyle over. He checked the readings twice to confirm. It's automated, he said. A Commonwealth relay buoy, probably. It picked up our signal and forwarded it to the nearest base. How long until a ship arrives? Depends on where the nearest base is. Could be days, could be weeks. I looked down at the basin. The assembly was building again, expanding their shrine, adding new structures. They'd been at it for over a month now, patient and methodical. The system we'd broken was growing back, just like I'd known it would. Do we tell everyone? I asked. Not yet. Not until we have confirmation a ship is actually coming. Doyle closed the monitoring slate. I don't want to give them hope just to take it away. So we kept it between us, maintained the routines, marked the days, waited. The response came on the 43rd day. The beacon's receiver activated with a tone I'd almost forgotten, a clear signal that meant someone was trying to establish contact. I activated the emergency comm protocol and heard static, then a voice. Commonwealth vessel Meridian responding to emergency beacon. Survivor count and status, please. I grabbed the transmitter. 12 survivors, multiple injured. We're on the ridge above the crash site, unable to provide exact coordinates, navigation systems destroyed. Static. Then, Meridian has your beacon location. ETA 4 days. Can you maintain your position? Affirmative. Understood. Maintain beacon broadcast. Meridian out. The signal cut. I sat there holding the transmitter, not quite believing what I'd heard. Doyle was grinning. 4 days. 4 days, I repeated. We told the others. The reaction was muted. We'd survived. We'd be leaving. The waiting was almost over. Pike wrote on her slate, "What happens to the assembly?" I looked down at the basin. They were still working, still drumming, building their machine around the coil we'd buried. They'd continue after we left. Continue for years, maybe, perfecting their system, integrating with the crashed ship we'd abandoned. "Nothing," I said. "We leave. They stay. The machine keeps growing." "Doesn't that bother you?" "Yes. But it's not my problem to solve anymore." She nodded and walked away. I stayed at the beacon, watching the assembly work and trying to feel something about the fact that we were leaving. Triumph, relief, satisfaction. Anything. But all I felt was tired. The Meridian arrived on schedule. It was a medium transport, a Commonwealth cargo runner that had been in the area when the relay buoy forwarded our distress call. They set down on the ridge at dawn, their landing thrusters scorching rock and turning loose soil to glass. The crew that emerged looked almost absurdly clean and healthy compared to us. They had medical kits, emergency supplies, thermal wraps. They moved like people who did this regularly, sweep the area, establish a perimeter, triage the survivors. A woman with commander's insignia approached me and Doyle. "I'm Captain Spencer. Are you the ranking officer?" "I am," Doyle said. "Captain Mark Doyle, Commonwealth survey vessel, Hearth." "What happened here?" "Catastrophic systems failure during atmospheric entry. We broke apart on descent, tried to establish shelter in the wreckage." He glanced at me. "Circumstances required us to abandon the core section." "What circumstances?" I almost laughed. "How do you explain it? How do you tell someone that the natives built a machine that used human bodies as components and we had to destroy our only shelter to escape it?" "Long story," I said. Spencer looked at me, then at the basin. The assembly's shrine was clearly visible from where we stood. "Are the natives hostile?" "No, just persistent." "Persistent how?" "They'll keep building around that wreck for years, probably forever. I'd recommend staying clear of the crash site entirely." She nodded and moved on to coordinate the evacuation. Her crew started loading survivors onto the transport. Medical cases first, then the walking wounded, then the rest of us. Pike and I were near the end of the list. While we waited, I walked to the beacon one last time. The antenna stood where I'd planted it, still broadcasting. The solar stack was dirty but functional. The monitoring slate showed green across all systems. This beacon would keep transmitting long after we left, calling out to an empty sky, telling any ship that passed through range that someone had been here once and needed help. I powered it down and disconnected the solar stack. Let the signal die. It had done its job. Pike appeared beside me. She looked at the silent antenna, then wrote, "You did it. Kept us alive. We kept each other alive. Will you tell them what really happened?" "Eventually, when they debrief us." I looked down at the basin. The assembly had stopped drumming. They stood in rows, watching the transport. "Will they believe us?" She shrugged, then wrote, "Does it matter?" "No," I said. "I suppose it doesn't." We walked to the transport together. The crew helped us aboard and sealed the hatch. Through the viewport, I watched the ridge recede as we lifted off. Watched the basin shrink. Watched the assembly return to their work, raising structures over the submerged coil, continuing the system we'd interrupted. The transport climbed through atmosphere and the planet fell away below us. Soon, we were in space, real space, cold and black and empty, and the world where we'd crashed was just another point of light among millions. Pike sat across from me in the passenger hold. She pulled out her slate and wrote, "What will you do now?" I looked at my hands. The scars on my forearms were permanent. Silver bands that marked where cables had scored my skin and filaments had threaded through my tissue. I'd carry these marks for the rest of my life, physical reminders of the choice I'd made and the cost it had extracted. "I don't know," I said. "Find another ship, probably, another survey mission. The transport entered FTL transit with a shudder I felt in my bones. The viewport showed nothing but grey-white distortion. We were going home, wherever that was now. Back to stations and ships and the ordinary work of staying alive in the spaces between stars. I closed my eyes and tried not to hear the drumming that wasn't there anymore. 6 months later, I was back in space. Different ship, different crew, different survey sector, same job, check structures, verify loads, make sure nothing fell apart when it shouldn't. I was good at it. Better than before, maybe because I knew now what happened when you trusted systems instead of verifying them yourself. I checked every fastener, counted every load point, marked every potential failure with my scriber, and tracked it until it was repaired or replaced. The crew called me obsessive. They weren't wrong. Pike was at a medical facility on Europa, undergoing reconstructive surgery on her vocal cords. The doctors said there was a 60% chance they could restore function, 40% chance she'd never speak again. She'd written to me once, a message that arrived through the civilian network. "The surgery's tomorrow. Wish me luck. Also, stop counting things. You'll drive yourself crazy." I'd written back, "Counting things is what keeps me sane. Good luck." I didn't know if she'd gotten my message. Communication lag between survey ships and inner system stations was measured in weeks sometimes. I was in the engineering bay, inspecting a pressure seal, when the captain called me to the bridge. "Foster. We picked up something on long-range scan. Wanted your opinion." I followed him to the navigation station. The display showed a system we'd passed 3 days ago, an uncharted world with a single large moon. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "Electromagnetic signatures on the surface, regular pulses. Could be natural, but the pattern's unusual." I leaned closer and studied the readings. The pulses came at regular intervals, low frequency, steady rhythm, the kind of pattern that suggested either highly organized geological activity or something artificial. "You think it's a crashed ship?" the captain asked. I thought about a basin ringed by ridges, about tall figures with drum sacks on their chests, about structures made from cable and stone, and the bodies of people who'd volunteered to become components in a system they didn't understand. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it's something else. Worth investigating?" I looked at the display, watched the pulses repeat, counted the intervals, mapped the positions. Then I shook my head. "No, mark it on the charts and move on." The captain looked surprised. "You sure?" "Could be survivors. Could be salvage." "I'm sure. Whatever's down there has been pulsing for a long time. If there were survivors, they'd have sent a distress call. If there's salvage, it's not worth the risk." "What risk?" I pulled out my scriber and marked a note on my slate. "Avoid EM source, possible integration hazard." Then I handed it to the captain. He read it, frowned, but didn't argue. "Your call. You're the structural expert." I left the bridge and returned to the pressure seal I'd been inspecting. The work was repetitive and precise, exactly the kind of thing I needed. Later in my quarters, I looked at the scars on my forearms, silver bands that had faded but never disappeared. I traced them with my finger and remembered the feeling of filaments threading through my tissue. Remembered the compulsion to kneel and connect and become part of something larger. Remembered the choice I'd made to end it. My slate chimed. A message from Pike. "Surgery successful. Voice at 60% function. Sounds like I've been shouting for a week, but I can talk again. How are you?" I wrote back, "Fine. Still checking fasteners. Still counting things. Still alive." Her response came through an hour later. "Good. That's all we can do. Stay alive and keep choosing." I read it twice, then set the slate aside and tried to sleep. In my dreams, I heard drumming, a steady rhythm in the background of everything, a reminder that some systems keep building themselves, with or without us, that machines become gods when communities choose to operate them, that the only real choice we have is whether to participate or walk away. I'd chosen to walk away. chosen to break the machine and accept the cost. Chosen survival over integration. It was the right choice. It had to be. Because if it wasn't, if I'd destroyed something that could have saved us all, killed people who'd found something better than individual survival, then I'd have to live with that too. Add it to the count of things I carried. Connor Vale and the port retrofit. Colton and the 10 others who'd died in the discharge. Sam and Ellis and everyone else who'd paid for the choice I'd made. The scars on my arms burned sometimes, phantom pain from dissolved filaments. Pike's voice would never be the same. The assembly was still down there, building their machine around a coil that would pulse for years until its power finally ran dry. And I was here, checking pressure seals on a survey ship, counting fasteners, marking potential failures, trying to prevent disasters I could control while accepting that some systems can only be ended, never fixed.